On Thursday, the 9th of July, the man who will one day be king put a small silver shell in his pocket, and by doing so, he joined a list that already holds his grandmother, his great-grandmother, and Winston Churchill. It happened in a fishing town on the East Sussex coast. There were no cameras from a palace balcony, no crown, no throne, no statement read from behind a lectern. There was a beach, a crowd of ordinary people, a school party from Germany, a toddler who burst into tears in the heat, and a group of fishermen who have worked the same shingle for longer than the monarchy has kept its current name. And in the middle of it stood the heir to the throne, being told that if he's ever challenged to produce that shell and cannot, he owes a fine to charity. That is the completed action of this episode, not a title conferred in a gilded hall, not a decision announced through the press office. A prince walked onto a working beach, was written onto a 126-year-old roll of honour kept by the poor of one town, and walked off it carrying a token that binds him to them. And I want to show you why that small thing on that particular day matters far more than the headline made it look. Because while the newspapers spent the week arguing about a courtroom loss and a wall of security around another royal, the future king quietly did the one thing the institution once punished his mother for doing. He went and stood level with ordinary people and let them make him one of their own. Let me start with the object, because there is a real one, and it is stranger and older than you would guess. It is called the Winkle Club. It was founded in the year 1900 by fishermen in Hastings Old Town, in a pub on Rockinore Road, to help the poorest families in the community. The idea was simple and a little mischievous. Every member carries a winkle, the small sea snail that clings to the rocks along that coast. And if another member calls out the challenge, "Winkle up!" you must produce your shell on the spot. Fail, and you pay a fine. Every penny of that fine goes to local good causes. It is charity dressed up as a game, invented by working men who had almost nothing, so that even they could give something away. Think about the plainness of that idea. There's no grand fund, no endowment, no committee of the wealthy deciding who deserves help. There's only a rule that any man can carry in his coat pocket, and a promise that the money it raises goes to the neighbours who need it most. The fishermen of Hastings did not wait for the state or the crown to look after their poor. They looked after their own, and they built a small, stubborn machine for doing it that has kept running for more than 120 years, through everything the last century could throw at that coast. Now, here is the part that turns a quaint local custom into a power object. The list of honorary members of that fisherman's club is not what you would expect from a pub on a beach. It includes Queen Elizabeth II. It includes the Queen Mother. It includes the Duke of Kent. It includes Field Marshal Lord Montgomery, who commanded armies. And it includes Sir Winston Churchill. On Thursday, the 9th of July, 2026, Prince William was handed a silver winkle and made an honorary member of that same club, joining the same roll of honour as his grandmother and his great-grandmother. He looked at the gift and said, "That is a stunning winkle." And then, with a grin, he said he would take good care of it. He even joked that he might carry it to the trooping of the colour. And there is a detail in the ritual that matters more than it first seems. He was told that if he's ever challenged to winkle up and he is caught without his shell, he pays the fine, but there is one exemption. A member in his working gear is let off. In other words, the rule bends only for the person who is actually at work, hands dirty doing the job. William laughed and said he might try it at the Trooping of the Colour, the grandest military ceremony in the royal calendar. It was a joke, but sit with the shape of it. A club run by fishermen has just handed the future king a rule that says the only excuse for coming up empty is that you were working. For a family whose entire modern argument is that it earns its keep by working, that is almost too neat to be an accident. Hold that image because we are going to come back to it. The heir to the British throne standing on a fishing beach promising a room full of working men that he will carry their shell in his pocket. He did not hand down a favour from above. He accepted membership on their terms and agreed in front of them to a rule that says he can be challenged like anyone else, and if he comes up empty, he pays. To understand why that is worth your evening, you have to remember what the rest of the week looked like around him. That same week, the story that dominated the royal news was not about the future king at all. It was about his brother. 2 days earlier, on Tuesday, the 7th of July, a High Court judge dismissed the privacy case that Prince Harry had brought against the publisher of the Daily Mail. Mr. Justice Nicklin ruled that the claims had not been proved. The reporting put the legal costs of that fight somewhere between 40 and 50 million pounds, and a further hearing about who pays those costs was set for the end of the month. That question is not yet settled. Around all of it swirled the other running story, the wall of security, the argument about who protects whom, the reason the rest of the family was not travelling. The press was consumed by loss, by lawyers, by exposure, by the machinery of protection and the limits of a prince's reach. And on the very same day the papers were full of that, more than 150 miles from the courtroom noise, the man who will inherit the whole institution was climbing a ladder onto a fishing boat to talk about Dover Sole. He did not arrive the way you would picture a future king arriving. He did not step out of the back of a car with an escort. He came down into the town on the East Hill Funicular Railway, the steepest in the country. A little cliff railway that ordinary holidaymakers ride for a couple of pounds. He was greeted by a crowd. A 15-month-old boy named Sebastian burst into tears the moment William crouched down to say hello, and instead of moving on, the prince stayed at the child's level and said, "I know how you feel. It is hot down here." A 4-year-old dressed as Spider-Man told him he would go swimming when he was older, and William told him, "Today is the chance. Go and make a big splash." These are small human moments, but notice the posture. He is not above the crowd. He's down in it at a toddler's eyeline in a heatwave, doing the least grand thing a future monarch can do. That is our first payoff, and it is where the headline stops early. The coverage called it a grand entrance, a prince playing crazy golf, a royal beating the heat. What the coverage mostly missed is the shape of the whole day, because when you lay the engagements out in order, they are not a random tour. They are a method, and it is a very specific method, one this family spent 30 years being frightened of. Look at the order of it. He began with the fishermen, the oldest working community in the town, whose trade goes back more than 1,000 years. This is not a museum. It is the largest beach-launched fishing fleet in the country. Boats hauled straight up onto the shingle because there is no harbour deep enough to hold them. Stop on that for a second because it tells you what kind of people these are. Everywhere else, fishing boats come home to a harbour wall and a sheltered basin. Here there is none. So for 1,000 years, the men of that beach have dragged their boats up the loose stones by hand, and by winch out of the reach of the tide and push them back down again before dawn to go out into the same cold water their great-grandfathers fished. There's nothing soft about it and nothing decorative. It is the hardest way left in the country to make a living from the sea, and they have kept doing it while easier trades all around them died. He met Paul Joy, the chairman of the local Fishermen's Protection Society, and heard about the real pressures on the fleet. Warmer seas that push the fish elsewhere. Bigger commercial boats that scoop up more than a small crew ever could. Overfishing that thins the catch year on year, and Brexit, which changed the rules these men live and die by. These are not abstract worries. They are the difference between a family trade surviving another generation or ending. William stood and listened to all of it. Not for a minute, not for a photograph, but long enough to hear the whole of it. The way you listen when you mean to remember. That is a small thing to describe and a large thing to do. A future king who lets fishermen talk until they are finished is a future king telling them, without saying it, that their trade is worth his time. On a working beach, that is the only currency that means anything, and he spent it freely. He climbed a ladder onto a working vessel called the Senlac Jack, a boat that goes out for Dover Sole, to hear it from the men who take her out at sea. He walked among the town's most famous buildings. The tall wooden net huts, painted black, some of them centuries old, built narrow and high so the fishermen could store their nets out of the salt and the rain. They are tall and thin because land on that shore was always scarce and dear. So the fishermen built upward instead of outward. Every one of those huts is a small monument to making do, to squeezing a living out of a shingle beach with no harbour to shelter in. Before he left the fishermen, he was given a book about the town's generations, wrapped in a tea towel printed with the image of those very net huts by a local artist. A book about generations, from a community fighting to have another one. Think about the tact of that gift for a moment. They did not hand the future king something gold or grand or expensive. They handed him a book about ordinary people who came before, wrapped in a cloth, showing the huts they still work in. It was a way of saying, here is who we are, do not forget us, and he took it in both hands. Then he moved to the young. He went to a miniature golf course that had just hosted a world championship the month before and met local champions there, and among them, the young people supported by a youth charity in the town called Extracts. He tried the course himself, and here the future king was allowed to be ordinary in the plainest possible way. He did not get a hole in one. He got stuck on the windmill, one of the trickiest holes, and only made it on his second attempt. A man who will one day wear the crown, missing an easy putt on a seaside crazy golf course in front of local children and laughing about it. No grandeur can survive a windmill hole. That is the point of standing there. And he ended his day on homelessness at a charity that takes derelict buildings around the town and turns them into homes and social spaces for people who have nowhere. He met the founder. He toured a room inside an old house that had been rescued from ruin and rebuilt into a youth club. Homelessness is not a passing cause for him. It is one of the things he has returned to again and again over the years. And it is, of everything he did that day, the deepest echo of where this all began. Fishermen, youth, the homeless, buildings brought back to life for people who have nowhere. That is not a photo call. That is a value system laid out on a single afternoon. And if it feels familiar, if something in it tugs at a memory, That is because you have watched a member of this family walk exactly this path before. You have seen it before because his mother built it. Think about what the ordinary picture of royalty used to be. A figure on a balcony, a wave from a distance, a ribbon cut, a plaque unveiled, a car door held open, a few minutes of polite conversation and then gone. Warm, but always with a line drawn between the crown and the crowd. Diana broke that line. She sat on hospital beds. She held hands nobody else would hold. She took her boys into ordinary places, ordinary queues, ordinary shelters, so that they would meet people and not as a duty. She closed the distance, and the country loved her for it, and the institution for a long time did not know what to do with a woman who refused to stay behind the glass. I want to be careful here and stay on the record. I am not going to tell you what William was thinking because I cannot see inside his head. And this channel does not invent thoughts. But I can put two things side by side that are both real and let you see the line between them. On one side, a day in 1993 when Diana, Princess of Wales, took an 11-year-old William to a homelessness shelter in London called The Passage and had him sit and talk with people who had no home, not for a camera, but so that he would know them as people. On the other side, a day in July 2026 when the same William, now the heir, ends his working day at a homelessness charity in a room made for young people with nowhere else to go. Same subject, same instinct, more than 30 years apart. You do not have to be told there is a thread there. You can see it. And before we go any further, hold on to that image of the boy in the shelter, because everything that happened on the beach this week only makes sense once you have seen where he learned it. This is not a prince who discovered the poor as a middle-aged man. This is a man who was walked into a room full of homeless people by his mother when he was 11 years old and told without a lecture that these were people worth his time. What you are watching in Hastings is not a new idea. It is a very old one coming back around. And there is one more piece of the record I want to add, because it makes the thread almost impossible to ignore. William has said himself in his adult work on Rough Sleeping that his mother shaped how he understands it. That is not my interpretation. That is on the record from him. So when he ends a working day in a seaside town by touring a rescued building turned into a home for young people with nowhere to go, he's not inventing a cause for a photo call. He's finishing a story his mother started with him when he was a boy. Sit with what that shelter visit really was. Back in 1993, Diana did not take an 11-year-old boy to a homelessness shelter for the picture. She took him because she had decided her sons would meet the people the palace usually kept at a careful distance and meet them as people in a room at the same height. That is a lesson you cannot teach from a balcony. You can only teach it by going and by bringing the child with you. William was that child, and more than 30 years later, the method has not changed at all. He still goes. He still gets down to eye level. He still lets the person in front of him be a person and not a duty on a schedule. The setting moved from a London shelter to a Hastings house rescued from ruin, but the instinct underneath it is the same instinct his mother pressed into him before he was old enough to understand what she was doing. And this is the reading I will stand behind, marked clearly as a reading. What William did in Hastings was the quiet continuation of the exact ground level method that once made his mother the most loved and, inside the institution, the most feared woman in the country. For years, the palace treated that instinct in Diana as a threat, as something too emotional, too personal, too close to the ordinary public to be safe. And now the man who inherits the throne carries it as his signature in the open on an ordinary Thursday, and no one calls it dangerous anymore. That brings us to the strongest objection, and I want to give it its full weight because a fair reading has to survive it. Someone will say this is just a normal royal engagement. Princes have visited fishing towns for 200 years. A ribbon here, a boat there, a joke about a shell. This is the job. It means nothing. And at first that sounds convincing. Then you place the dates next to it. Because here is the second receipt. This did not happen in a quiet week. It happened in the loudest possible week for this family, while the entire royal press was fixed on a courtroom, a cost question, a security wall, exposure and loss, and the limits of what a prince can command. In a week, defined by what one royal could not win, the man who will actually inherit the crown chose to spend his day being made a member of a poor town's charity club by the descendants of the men who founded it. He did not compete for the headline. He did the opposite. He went somewhere the cameras barely follow and did the work that does not trend. And that choice in that week is the clearest possible statement of what he thinks the job is, made without a single word of statement. And consider what a normal engagement usually leaves behind. A line in a court diary, a photograph in a local paper, a plaque with a date on it. What William walked away with in Hastings was different in kind. He walked away written into a living register kept by fishermen alongside a queen mother, and a wartime prime minister. A normal engagement is a visit. This was an induction. He did not just call on the town took him in. And a town that takes you in has decided something about you that no press office arranged and no rival can undo. He was measured by ordinary people on their terms, and they chose to keep him. One story of that week is about what can be taken away. The other is about something being freely given. And only one of those men will one day wear the crown. Now let me take you back to the object, the shell, because this is where the real reversal lives. Think again about that list. Queen Elizabeth II, the Queen Mother, Churchill. These are not names you associate with a small fisherman's charity in a seaside town. And yet each of them at some point agreed to belong to it. The connection is old and it is real. The future queen visited that town as Princess Elizabeth back in 1951, more than 70 years ago, and was presented with a golden Winkle brooch. Her mother, the Queen Mother, was a member too. So on Thursday, when a silver shell was pressed into William's hand, it did not simply link him to a charity. It linked him to his own grandmother as a young princess, on that same shore, being handed the same strange gift by the same fisherman's club, 3/4 of a century apart. The blood that connects them is one thing. The choice to belong to a poor town's club is another, and both were sitting in his palm at once. There is something almost tender in that overlap when you slow down and look at it. A young Princess Elizabeth stood on that shingle before her father had even died, before the weight of a 70-year reign had settled on her, and a fisherman's club that helps the hungry pinned a winkle to her. Now her grandson stands on the same stones decades of history later, and the same club presses the same token into his hand. The kings and queens change, the prime ministers come and go, but the fishermen are still there, still keeping their list, still deciding for themselves who deserves a place on it. That continuity does not belong to the palace, it belongs to the town. And think about who was actually there to witness it. because that matters too. This was not a hall of dignitaries. The crowd that gathered on that beach was made of ordinary people on an ordinary hot day, holiday makers who had ridden the little cliff railway down for a couple of pounds, local families, a school party visiting all the way from Germany, a crying toddler, and a small boy dressed as a comic book hero. These were the witnesses to the induction of a future king, not courtiers and not cameras from a palace, but the same sort of people the club was founded to serve. And that is exactly the right congregation for a thing like this. A charity built by working men to help hungry neighbours does not need an audience of the powerful to make its honours mean something. It needs the town. The town was there, and in front of that town, on their shingle, the heir to the throne agreed to belong to them. There is no grander witness list a place like that could offer, and no press office could have arranged a truer one. The club is older than 2 world wars. It was formed by men who gathered in a pub because the children of their neighbours were going hungry, and they decided that even people with almost nothing could still find a way to give. It has outlasted governments, prime ministers, and the reshaping of the entire monarchy, and it still keeps its list. When William was written onto it on Thursday, he was not being given a souvenir. He was being placed by ordinary people alongside a queen who reigned for 70 years, a queen mother who came to stand for the whole country in wartime, a prime minister who led it through its darkest hour, and a field marshal who won its battles. The palace decides who gets a title. The palace does not decide who the Winkle Club honours. There are honours the state can grant and honours it cannot. And this one belongs entirely to the town, precisely because it cannot be bought, ordered, or arranged. And that is the reversal. On the surface, this looked like a prince doing a small kindness for a small town. Underneath, it is the other way around. The town gave him something the institution could never hand him. It gave him a place freely chosen on a roll of honour that measures a person not by blood or rank, but by whether they showed up for the poor of that place. The crown passes by blood and cannot be taken back. But this, the shell, the membership, the standing among ordinary people is not passed by blood at all. It has to be earned in person, by turning up and standing level. And on the 9th of July, the heir turned up and earned it. That is why the small silver winkle is the object of this episode and not the crown. A crown is conferred. It can be argued about, priced, resented, removed from a brother, withheld from a wife. A crown sits at the centre of every loud story this family has told this year, but the shell was given, not conferred. And a gift given freely by fishermen cannot be clawed back by a committee, a court, or a costs order. In the same week the news was full of what can be lost, William quietly collected something that cannot be. Look at how sharply those two things sit against each other. In one part of the country, lawyers were counting a bill somewhere between 40 and 50 million pounds, and a court had just closed a door. In another, a handful of fishermen opened one for nothing and asked only that he keep a shell on him. One of those stories is measured in money and can be taken further away with the next ruling. The other cannot be measured in money at all, and no ruling can undo it. That is not a coincidence I am inventing. It is simply the two things that were true in the same week, laid side by side. So here is the consequence. The strongest reading this record will support. The real power in this family is not only the one you can see on the balcony. It is the quiet authority of the person who understands what the job is actually for and does it whether the cameras come or not. He did not announce it. He did not need to. The list did it for him. And a monarchy that once feared Diana's common touch now survives in part because her son carries it as his own. The touch they feared in the mother is the inheritance in the son. It did not need a ceremony, it needed a shell in his pocket. Which leaves one open question, the next public test, and I will hand it to you honestly, rather than pretend I can close it. William now carries, by his own joke, a winkle he says he might bring to the trooping of the colour. The rule of the club is that if he is ever challenged, he must produce it or pay. It is a small, funny, almost silly thing, but it is also a promise made to ordinary people on a beach in front of witnesses that he will keep a piece of them on him, even at the grandest ceremony the monarchy has. The next time you see him at a state occasion in the gold and the ritual, remember there may be a small seashell in his pocket, put there by fishermen. Whether a future king actually keeps a token of the poor near him when he stands at the centre of the crown, that is the whole question of what kind of monarch he intends to be. And that answer will not come from a palace statement. It will come the way this whole day came from what he quietly chooses to do when he thinks the important cameras are pointed somewhere else. And notice how quiet it all was. There was no grand announcement, no statement from the palace explaining what any of it meant, no press release calling it historic. There almost never is with him. If you were not paying close attention, you would have missed the whole shape of it, and most of the coverage did. That is the thing about the quiet method. It does not shout, so it does not always get counted. But it is being watched and it is being remembered. The fishermen of that beach will not forget the day the future king climbed their ladder, and a monarchy is built in the end, not out of ceremonies, but out of days like that, stacked one on top of another until a country decides it trusts the person at the center of them. Now, I want to hear from you because so many of you lived this. Tell me what you remember of Diana when she crouched down to somebody's level, hand out, no distance between her and an ordinary person. Where were you when you first saw her do it? And do you see her in the sun who stood level with a fishing crew and a crying child on that beach this week? Tell me in the comments. I read them and I remember them, and the ones about her stay with me the longest. And here is the harder question if you want to sit with it. She was loved for that touch, and she was also inside the walls of the institution feared for it, treated as something too close to the ordinary public to be safe. So tell me what you think now. Was the palace right to be frightened of a royal who stood level with ordinary people, or was that instinct the very thing that would one day keep the whole crown alive? Because if it is the son who now carries it in the open on an ordinary Thursday, then the thing they once tried to contain in the mother may turn out to be the thing that saves the monarchy in the end. I would rather hear your answer than give you mine. If this was worth your time, stay close, because there is a next chapter coming, and the question of what kind of king he means to be is only just beginning to answer itself.